If somebody was to ask you the question, what was lacking most from modern video games today, how would you answer that question? I think my answer would lie somewhere in the video game concepts themselves. With multiple studios getting closed down for failed projects and video games being more expensive than ever to produce, it's no surprise as to why all of these developers and publishers play it so safe now. But there was a time when studios took risks and had these wild ideas for what could be a cool video game concept. One of those being Team 17's Worms series.
You miss!
Huh?
Achoo!
Team 17's Worms. Video games are such an interesting medium of entertainment because they can change so much with time, even when it just involves the time passing them. Some games age like wine, some games age like milk, and some just get left in the toy box. Whether that's because of technology changes that render the game hard to play on modern hardware, or it's simply just a case of the developers walking out for milk and cigarettes and never coming back, the latter is starting to become the case for one of my favorite video game series, the one we're talking about in this video. So you're wondering what Worms is, huh? Well, have you ever finished watching A Bug's Life and thought to yourself, I wonder what it would be like to be the worm in that movie, but having a territory war with other worms with real weapons? Well, the brilliant developers over at Team 17 did when they came up with Worms. I wonder how they came up with that name. Worms has went through a lot of iterations over the years, but one thing that stayed consistent is that gameplay formula. Except for this one, my God, we gotta go back. Okay, we'll talk about that one in a little bit. My first time with this series was when I went over to a friend's house and he had a GameCube, which I didn't have, so I always thought it was this cool foreign alien thing. There's two things that I remember about that GameCube. One was when you were playing Need for Speed Underground, the B button was the nitrous button because it was the big red button. And two, we played a lot of Worms on that.
Oh, leave me alone!
I was a kid who didn't get to play a lot of adult video games, so when I saw a worm with a gun on the box, I was like, whoa, this looks really cool. What's this gonna be? And it turned out, it was pretty fun. But we gotta go back a little bit further to actually talk about how this series began. When you think of turn-based games, you might think of Final Fantasy, XCOM, or more recently, Baldur's Gate 3, which has been exploding in popularity for more than one reason. But one type of game you might not think of in the turn-based genre would be a shooter, and especially not one with anthropomorphic worms. But in 1995, which also just happens to be the best year to be born, the Worms series came out blasting on PC, PlayStation, and even the Game Boy, surprisingly enough. I don't know how that ran at the time, but the premise behind Worms is pretty simple. Create a team of custom named worms, and then jump into battle using bazookas, grenades, machine guns, baseball bats, Uzis, and even Ryu's headband to knock the enemies out of the level.
Oh dear!
In Worms, you have multiple teams fighting each other in randomly generated environments, those of which are completely destructible, by the way. You got a friend that won't stop hiding underground in a layer of grinders? Well, take care of him the American way. This approach to level design kept this simple turn-based combat interesting and introduced a new layer of strategy with every playthrough. Different weapons will create larger or smaller amounts of damage to the playfield, as well as react differently based on the wind direction. Not that these mechanics ever just stop me from blindly throwing my bullets. I'm not very good.
Stupid!
The gameplay's simple, but it does have mechanics that skilled players can take advantage of. Good luck figuring out how to use the ninja rope if you've never played a Worms title before. This makes Worms easy to pick up and play, in certain context if you can get used to the controls, but rewarding to actually get good at. And while the star of the show is the gameplay, the glue that really holds it together is that slapstick humor that's peppered throughout the game. If you're playing a game with worms as the star of the show, you gotta make them interesting. And despite the dated visuals of the original, Team 17 managed to pull off clever humor with 3D cutscenes featuring the nightmare-fueled squirmers clumsily throwing shots back and forth, as well as some tongue-in-cheek dialogue throughout the gameplay.
Just you wait!
You can even customize little things like the gravestone that your team would show when losing a worm. It was a winning formula. 2D head-to-head gameplay with silly 3D cutscenes that really helped bring the game to life. But could you imagine if the entire gameplay experience was in 3D? It'd be like we actually got to play the cutscenes. If only we had the technology to make a 2D Worms game. but in 3D. Oh, look, new consoles just got announced. That's convenient. Typically, when games try to reformat themselves, it just doesn't quite capture the feel of the original. Seeing your favorite gameplay from a new perspective or with different systems can completely disconnect you from the gameplay experience. No, I don't want a history lesson while I'm playing a Mario game. But man, when I went to my friend's house and got my hands on Worms 3D, it almost felt like the turn-based territorial war was made for this gameplay style. Worms 3D took everything that made the original game special and added a Z-axis. That gives it a third dimension, right? I hope I'm right about that. Now you could freely roam around an open environment and strategically hide behind cover, or see the look of your enemy's face right before you blast them. This leap in tech would provide immersive elements like in-game cutscenes that enhance the story mode levels, or it would add cinematic flair to special attacks and airstrikes. What's really cool though is that those randomly generated environments carried over from those previous entries, despite the fact it was now in 3D. This allowed for the same variety that was previously offered, but now on a much bigger scale. Every time you play a match in a generated level, you have a new terrain to explore. This would keep the strategy fresh, and the AI calculating its moves to compensate. Of course, if you had friends, you could take this a step further and have up to 4 teams in a game at one time.
Stupid.
Worms 3D is kinda cursed by some clunky controls, but if you can get over confusing the jump button with your trigger button, there's some fun to be had.
No.
Hell, even the visuals still look pretty good thanks to that cartoony art style. Just like your mom, Worms 3D holds up pretty well despite its age, and it's pretty easy to see why the series continued after its debut into 3D.
My job here is done. Shazam!
Worms 3D would be followed up with Forts Under Siege. This one was a little bit of a spin-off. It was 3D Worms, but with a base building twist where you have to hold down your fort while staying alive. I remember playing this one for a good bit, but it definitely wasn't my favorite. I remember the layouts just being very flat and not offering much in the way of level variety or destructible environments. Little did I realize that the direct sequel to Worms 3D, Worms 4 Mayhem, came out right after Forts Under Siege in 2005. This one was never really on my radar, but thanks to the power of making YouTube videos, I was able to discover this one for the first time. Well, somewhat, but we'll come back to that. Worms 4 is by most accounts an improvement to the formula left over by Worms 3D. The developers doubled down on improving the in-game cinematics, making them seamless with the start of the game. The gameplay itself feels snappier and more responsive than the original game too, giving the flow of the gameplay just a little bit more polish.
Yeehaw.
There's new weapons to play with, and they come with a nice quality of life improvement, being able to read a description of what they do and how to actually use them. And in case you got tired of picking up something good when you received an airdrop, new mystery boxes will give you the opportunity for a bad time if you aren't lucky.
To my face, punk.
Randomly generated environments return again, but this time they're a little bit different. The playable levels that you get in Worms 4 at the start only consist of levels that seem to use the assets from the level generation. If you're just picking this up to play with a friend or the bots, you may want to set aside some time to play the story levels. Of course, you aren't just playing for the levels because there's a slew of customization options for your worms that you'll get as you progress. Or I'm sure you could just find a save file. But to touch back on that level generation, the level generation now consists of structures including bases and walls, which seems to give it less of a focus on verticality. I just couldn't find as many options to tweak the generations that I had in Worms 3D, but I could be missing something here. What isn't missing is the AI when you play them on hard. My god, they either just give up whenever they're having to calculate any kind of strategy, or they'll just launch an explosive across the map with pinpoint accuracy. Overall, while Worms 4 seems to be an overall improvement, I still like the amazing groundwork and coat of paint that came with Worms 3D.
Ragnarok!
It's sort of hard to choose a favorite here, especially when these are your only options for 3D Worms titles. Luckily, you can have your cake and eat it too, with Worms Ultimate Mayhem. Team 17 combined both single-player campaigns, levels, and challenges from Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem to create the most feature-packed 3D Worms title possible. The icing on the cake is that there's still online play for the PC version. The bad news is that it plays like shit on PC, and it's currently impossible to play it on a modern console. It looks like you can pick up a physical copy for the PS3 and 360 for a few bucks in a collection that includes a few other titles, but otherwise you'll have to steer towards the PC release. For whatever reason, I couldn't even get the other console versions of Ultimate Mayhem to emulate. It's serviceable for sure, but it definitely feels like a lazy port with low frame rate, horrendous button mapping for controls, and half-functioning controller support. I was able to play for a while just fine with my Xbox controller, but then for some reason recently, I just could not get any controller to work at all with this game. That pretty much cancels out any chance of couch co-op, and because of that low frame rate, I'm just not interested in using my keyboard and mouse, to be honest with you. Funny enough though, it worked on my Steam Deck without a problem, so take that for what it's worth, I guess.
Dude, check out the rack on that. The multi-effects rack.
Also, when it comes to that online play, you can pretty much expect to get rolled over in every single match. It's one of those games where the only people playing are the people that only play this game. So they probably know the game better than the developers at this point. They also probably don't want to play with you either. I'm not sure if this is just an issue with the game not having private lobbies, but almost every time I joined a game, I was either kicked out or double teamed by the other players. But at the very least, I can confirm that the online is functional on the PC. In the year 2023, this seems to be the story of where 3D Worms titles comes to an end. But that's not the end of the series as a whole. Despite the fact that the game was successful in 3D, that doesn't mean there wasn't an audience for that classic 2D gameplay. Up to the time of Ultimate Mayhem's release and beyond, Team 17 was still releasing 2D titles and even had a few golf spin-offs. Not sure who asked for that. I didn't even know that existed until I started working on this video. You could even find Worms on your phone with Worms 4, but that's a totally different 2D entry. But the most notable 2D entry out of all of these titles in the Worms series was definitely WMD. WMD released in late 2016 and made its way onto pretty much anything with a screen. You can play it on your phone, your tablet, and pretty much every current generation console, including the Switch, PS5, and Xbox Series consoles. It's a pretty good proprietary engine they got running there. Whether you should play this entry or not, though, is where things get interesting. In a world dominated by cutting-edge 3D graphics, Team 17 decided to completely buck the trend and return to their roots with a 2D entry, this time opting to use a hand-drawn art style. Not only does this art style look great, it gives them the flexibility to scale this to multiple platforms without it looking too out of place. While I think the 3D titles still look pretty good, there's no denying that the hand-drawn visuals and smooth, simple animation will stand the test of time and look good regardless of if it's on a tablet screen or an 80-inch TV. The sound design is also arguably the best in the series, featuring meaty explosions and crispy gunfire that really liven up the battleground. It'll play pretty good in that battleground too, because the easy pick up and play nature of Worms works so well in 2D.
Fire is the key for survival.
If you want to throw it on your Switch, your phone for a few quick games, or just pull it up on the TV for a short party game, the controls are fairly easy to get used to. But while all this feels familiar, that's not to say that WMD doesn't have a few tricks up its sleeve. For what I believe is the first time ever for the series, you now have vehicles that you can pilot to help you navigate and rip up the battlefield. You have tanks, mechs, and helicopters, which add a new layer of strategy and really go the extra mile to help liven up the gameplay. If the heat from the vehicles gets too crazy, you can hide your worms inside buildings now. That's not all though, because there's also weapon crafting that gives new variants to the weapons you've already been using. Of course, if you just hate fun, you can opt out of these elements in the basic game settings, but it seems like Team 17 really wanted to make an effort to add in something fresh to the genre despite returning to 2D. Hell, they even still include the random level generation to keep the game interesting. I think the most surprising part of all is that I actually spent a good amount of time in WMD. I'm not the biggest fan of the original 2D style, but WMD is just so damn fun, I can't resist it. The gameplay moves so smoothly that it feels like a proper modern iteration, and with that high quality audio, WMD really gets immersive. Online multiplayer makes a return, so that just gives me another reason to get addicted to it. Side note, you probably don't want to play online multiplayer if you're game sharing the game on Steam with somebody, because you might just be one turn from winning a 2v1 when all of a sudden you get kicked out because you had a certain amount of time before you had to boot off the game. So you lose the match that you were just working towards for like 20 minutes. Not that I'm speaking from experience or anything. That being said, the same issues with the previous Worms multiplayer do come into play here. There's again a very small active player base here, so you can expect to play with either the best in the game or somebody who didn't realize starting the game in single player was an option. I would also still get frequently kicked from lobbies here too, so maybe it was just a me thing. I don't know. Maybe people just don't want to play games with me. That's fine. I get it. I'm not a fun guy. With this sleeper hit under its belt, what could Team 17 possibly be coming up with next? It had been a while since the last 3D title, so maybe that could be in the works. Or maybe they would just expand on WMD with some new DLC. Or they could release a new collection to support modern platforms. Who knows? Well, in December of 2020, we got an early Christmas present with our answer. I think it's fair to say that 2020 was not an easy year for game developers, and not a lot of other people now that I mention it, especially not for smaller indie studios like Team 17. They needed a game that could drum up some funding, and a new Worms entry could do that, especially if they mix up the formula to get a piece of that ever-growing multiplayer scene. This was not how I expected them to do that. So Worms Rumble released in late 2020 to very lukewarm reception. But why is that? It seemed like after WMD they had a good idea of what the fans wanted. Well, I guess what the fans wanted wasn't enough. Because in an obvious attempt to cater to a wider audience, Worms Rumble would present itself as a 2.5D battle royale. And this title would have Worms seeing potentially the biggest change it's ever seen. Up until now, Worms was a turn-based strategy game. Even the golf spinoff kept this concept. It was a simple but effective gameplay style that was universally loved by its audience. So Team 17 decided to get rid of it. Worms Rumble is a real-time 2D shooter, which definitely takes away some of the charm of its legacy. The other element that's stripped from its legacy is probably the art style. I think it's fair to say that for the most part, Worms kept a pretty consistent art style over the years. It was cartoony without being too childlike in nature, but with Worms Rumble, it definitely seems like they were aiming for a younger audience. The art style in general just looks a lot more generic, almost like it came from an asset store. The worms have these big innocent eyes and the environments just look pretty soft. I'd like to tell you what Worms Rumble actually feels like to play, but according to Steam reviews, nobody's playing it. For some reason, in a world where every decent multiplayer shooter is free to play, Worms Rumble is still charging for entry. There's even reviews desperately begging Team 17 to make this game a free to play to get it a higher player base, but it seems like them selling a ticket to a multiplayer only experience is the priority. But hey, while you're buying Worms Rumble, you can go ahead and buy a few cosmetic and emote packs to go along with it, because they're selling a bunch of microtransaction DLC for it too. So where does all of this place the Worms franchise today? Well, WMD seems to still be relatively popular. It doesn't seem like it goes on sale very often, so I'm sure it's still selling fairly well for them. As far as the 3D titles go, I definitely think they could be re-released in a new collection that maybe includes WMD along with it. Hell, maybe just release a collection with every game they can fit on it at this point. I'm not sure if there's even a demand for a new Worms title today, but putting new releases on modern platforms could definitely be a step in the right direction. To be honest with you, I'm a little worried about Team 17 at this point. In a modern AAA world where studios are getting shut down left and right, I genuinely wonder if they'll even be able to exist much longer. I mean, really, what are they working on right now? Anyways, if you want to play Worms today, go pick up a copy of WMD or Ultimate Mayhem on your PC. Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem also work pretty well on emulators if you have that option. But other than that, what do you think of the Worms series? Are you familiar with it at all? Did you grow up with it? Is this your first time hearing about it? Do you think it can even exist in today's world? Let me know what you think in the comments. Special thanks to all of the channel members supporting the content, and I hope to see you guys soon on the next retrospective. Dude, this video has been like months in the making. I've been playing Worms off and on, going back and forth on whether I should even do a video on this topic, but I feel like it's worth talking about, man. I want to see this series come back. Bring the creativity back. See you guys.